And also, it's a wonderful privilege to welcome John Hedley Brooke, who's often come to the Faraday events. He was previously the Andreas Idrios Professor of the History of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. He's also been previously the President of the International Society of Science and Religion. And using all the various words previously might give you the indication that he's somehow not doing anything now. That's not at all the case, because he's still extremely active in writing and in broadcasting, in conferences, and indeed doing lots of reviewing, I happen to know, in papers and books and things like that, and has made a huge difference to the whole field of the historical study of science and religion in this country and indeed beyond. So this morning John is going to be speaking to us about the roots of the conflict thesis, and I'll hand over to John. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Dennis, for those very kind words. Can I just say what a very great pleasure it is to be here. These courses that you've been enjoying during the week, as you've found out now, are absolutely splendid, and you have a chance to meet a variety of scholars who work in this field. I was asked if I would speak about the origins of the conflict thesis, and so that's what I'm going to do. What I have in mind is to raise a series of questions and then make a few comments about each. And you'll be surprised to learn that the first question is, what is the conflict thesis? That we're going to look at the origins of. Now, as with all historical theses, it is not a single thing. It has existed in many different forms. For example, that science and religion have to be seen, must be seen, as opposing forces in the world, or, slightly different, that science and orthodox religious institutions characteristically come into conflict. Or again, slightly different, that science and theology offer competing explanations or interpretations of the world. Well, we could carry on multiplying versions, but I want to draw your attention to one critical thing common to those three examples. In each case, we're confronted with something that philosophers call essentialism. That is the view that there is an essence of science and there is an essence of religion that we can specify, such that these two essences are incompatible or are in conflict. And that, I think, gets to the heart of the conflict thesis as it is usually presented. In other words, there's something about the nature of science and something about the nature of religion, which means that at rock bottom they come into conflict. Notice that there's something timeless about essentialist claims. You define religion, you define science in some way, such that they are always, and presumably always have been, on this view, in conflict. And this is one reason why the thesis we're examining has attracted both the attention and the criticism of historians. Because historians don't like timeless things. Historians are very well aware that things are always changing. And therefore there's some tension between essentialist philosophies and the historical work of those who examine science and religion in history. Just to give you an idea of how the conflict thesis has often been used historically, suppose you find, looking in the past, that there's a brilliant scientific insight. You might find it, for example, in the work of the Greek astronomer and philosopher Aristarchus from the island of Samos, who for centuries before Copernicus proposed that it is the Earth that moves, that it's the Earth that goes round the sun. Why is it that for the succeeding 2,000 years nearly, that idea never caught on. Well, if you subscribe to the conflict thesis, there is an automatic, knee-jerk explanation. It must be the church. The church must have suppressed this dangerous new idea. And so one feature of the conflict thesis is that it sets up this model of conflict as a way of interpreting history. And reference to a moving earth, of course, takes us to one of the great examples from history, always promulgated by those who like conflict, and this is the Galileo affair. One of the authors we're going to examine in just a few minutes' time, the American chemist cum historian John Draper, in his book, A History of the Conflict of Science and Religion, wrote this: "The Catholic Church condemned Galileo knowing he was right." Now, I have to say that is a preposterous statement, because when you actually investigate it, of course, the real problem for the church was that there didn't seem to be sufficient compelling evidence for it to change its interpretations of Scripture. But I just give that as a little insight into the kind of history you find in works which promulgate this view that science and religion characteristically have been in conflict. That's my first question. What is the conflict thesis? My second question is, does it not have a certain plausibility? Is this a thesis that we can, as it were, understand, and also understand why people are attracted to it? And I think I have to say that there are grounds for at least coming to this notion with certain sympathetic precepts, presuppositions. And they take two forms usually. One is what we might call epistemological, that is concerned with how we derive knowledge about the world. And the other source are the historical examples, of which the Galileo case is a celebrated one. Those who like to argue for conflict often claim that religious belief rests on faith and trust and respect for ancient authorities, whereas science relies on evidence for confirming its theories, and indeed has very rigorous criteria before one could say that a particular theory, for example, has been confirmed or corroborated. And we've had a very interesting example. I guess you've been talking about it during the week. But it did strike me that the recent discovery, in inverted commas, of the Higgs boson particle is a rather nice example of the way in which scientists claimed, and indeed have spent a huge amount of cash, claimed that they were not going to accept the theory of a Higgs field until there was rigorous experimental confirmation of that theory. And I think those who proposed the conflict thesis would say that kind of corroboration, that rigor, is what is lacking in religious claims and how one might authenticate. So that's one set of assumptions one could bring if we're asking about the plausibility of the conflict thesis. Secondly, those who like the conflict model, I think, do see an opposition between naturalistic worldviews that have gained ground simply through the explanatory success of the sciences, and religious worldviews, which in many cases preserve a place for the supernatural, or at least for spiritual realities. So that old dichotomy between nature and supernature, matter and spirit, these dichotomies, these antitheses, do still, I think, feature in contemporary debate. But it's the historical examples that are often wheeled out to confirm the plausibility of the conflict thesis. So we've already had a word about the Galileo affair, but before Galileo was put on trial, there was another celebrated case where Giordano Bruno was burnt at the stake in Rome. For several heresies, actually, but principally, I think, for sticking to his guns when he claimed that there was not just one universe, there was an infinite plurality of worlds, an infinite plurality of inhabited worlds. And this was certainly a dangerous idea in the late 16th and early 17th century. So you have there the makings of a story about martyrdom, about the scientific thinker burnt at the stake for his heretical views. Well, there are many nuances to that story, but let's just remind ourselves again of the Galileo case, a nice picture from the 18th century Enlightenment showing a defiant Galileo there up against the authority of the Inquisition in Rome. And you can almost hear Galileo saying, "And yet it moves." I think he never did. We haven't got much evidence for it. But that's how the Enlightenment reconstructed the whole story. It is, if you like, new science repelled by ecclesiastical authority. And just as a third example, again, so often wheeled out, when Darwin published his theory of the origin of species in 1859, it was attacked by churchmen. There was a great diversity of response, but perhaps the most famous immediate critic was Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, nicely caricatured there. He was known as Soapy Sam, because he was very lubricious. I mean, he was very slippery, though a great public speaker. And Wilberforce had a genuine concern about Darwin's theory. What does it do to the doctrine that humankind is made in the image of God? The uniqueness of humankind, as far as Wilberforce was concerned, was compromised by the Darwinian theory, a theory which simply could not be accepted. So you've got three classic examples there from the history: the burning of Bruno, the trial of Galileo, hostility towards Darwin. This is all, as it were, food for the conflict historian. That was my second question. Is there not a certain plausibility in the conflict model? My third question is this: when was the thesis propounded? When does it begin to appear as a common and indeed influential interpretation of historical events? I can't actually answer that question because the thesis has had different roots at different times and places in the cultural history of the West. For example, if we just turn to France in the 18th century, that should be Diderot, famous editor of the Encyclopédie, a whole cornucopia of secular knowledge. Diderot often regarded as the first modern atheist. And in France, in the middle years of the 18th century, you can find science and religion placed, as it were, at opposite ends of a polar system. But that's 100 years before the conflict in the English-speaking world became public knowledge. In this country, in the early years of the 19th century, there was a great increase in standards of literacy, and books, pamphlets, went into huge numbers and editions as an increasingly literate public became interested in matters of science and indeed in matters of religion. And in the Anglophonic world, I think it is true to say that it's largely after the 1840s and 50s when the debates on human evolution crystallized. It's in that sort of period that a sense of conflict was experienced and promoted in a way that had not been so keenly felt before. We might say conflict became a public spectacle. It certainly did in 1860, when Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley had their encounter at the University of Oxford, when the British Association for the Advancement of Science was in town. You saw the caricature of Wilberforce a moment ago. There was the well-known caricature from Vanity Fair of Thomas Henry Huxley. If you look very carefully, you'll see the artist was ape. And this is a reference, of course, to the fact that at the Oxford meeting, Wilberforce and Huxley had fallen out because, I'm sure you've heard the story, but Wilberforce thought he could score a quick point against the Darwinians by asking Huxley whether he preferred to think of himself descended from an ape on his grandfather's or his grandmother's side. Whereupon, according to the legend, Huxley rubbed his hands with glee, whispered to a neighbour, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands," and said that as a matter of fact he would prefer to have an ape for an ancestor than a bishop. or essentially a man who used his great intellectual gifts and authority to pontificate on matters that he didn't know much about. So this is the famous public spectacle of conflict, and it's there in 1860. Now historians again have had a wonderful time, and I've joined the fun myself deconstructing that conflict, because it's been turned into something that I think in America is called the Great Debate, which it certainly wasn't, and it was never set up as a debate in the first place. But let's not get diverted by the complications at this stage. Another very public spectacle when we talk about the appearance and the roots of the conflict thesis was in 1874 in Belfast, where the famous physicist John Tyndall, who was then president of the British Association, gave his presidential address in an aggressive manner that alienated both Protestant and Catholic Christian sensibilities in Ireland. And Tyndall writes a long history of what we might loosely call the development of scientific naturalism or scientific materialism. And his history is one of triumph, of repeated triumph of science over mystical, superstitious, spiritualistic, supernatural claims to knowledge. And I said Tyndall's lecture is aggressive. He says at one point, we claim, that's the scientific community, we claim and we shall wrest from theology the entire domain of cosmological theory. Leaving theology, well, what? Nothing, if you're looking at it from a strictly and exclusively scientific point of view. Tyndall, in that public lecture, actually accused Darwin of dithering, of being too inclined to bring the supernatural into science. We don't think of Darwin doing that, but Tyndall focused on that passage in The Origin of Species, particularly the very last paragraph actually, where Darwin talks about life breathed into one or a few forms from which all other living things have descended. And Tyndall is aware that Darwin is using biblical language there. And Tyndall says, this is not good enough. Science is not interested in that kind of compromise. You've jolly well got to stick to nature and to your naturalistic explanation. So even Darwin gets a slap on the wrist from Tyndall. And remember, this is a public event. Hundreds of people in Belfast were present. A year later, John Draper, to whom I referred briefly earlier, published a book called A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And there you see what it looked like in one of the editions. Sold like hotcakes, an immensely important book. It was translated into many other languages, and we shall come to one case in a moment. This book is basically a diatribe against the Roman Catholic Church. It's not simply a large overview of religion and science. It focuses very specifically on the way the Catholic Church has been an oppressor of science. And this is in the context of a question which Draper claims has been given new cultural significance following Darwin's work. And the issue was this: how is the natural world governed? Is it by an intervening deity, or is it by natural laws? And for Draper, those two views conflict. You can't, as far as he's concerned, have both. And Draper's history, I have to say, has an attractive kind of simplicity about it, and I think we get the text there, yes. The history of science is not a mere record of isolated discoveries. Well, he's certainly correct in saying that. But then he says it is a narrative of the conflict of two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on one side, and the compression arising from traditional faith and human interests on the other. So that's 1875. Conflict. The word conflict is in the title of a book. 20 years later, Andrew Dixon White, the first president of Cornell University, published a book in which there was not merely conflict between science and religion, but outright warfare. White's book is called A History of the Warfare. I'm sorry, we seem to have just got out of phase here. Let me see if I can find... No, I've lost White, and I'm sorry about that. Some would say it's not a great loss. The book was the most thoroughly documented story of how the clergy, over several hundred years, had resisted scientific innovation after scientific innovation. White points out that science had generated many discoveries, many views of the world, many new technologies with which the church always seemed unsympathetic. So, for example, we actually get a case of new technologies for coping with thunderstorms. And I seem to have lost those. I do apologise for this. Let's leave Huxley there because we're coming back to him in a second. The example I wanted to give was simply that in the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin worked out the electrical nature of lightning and thunderstorms. And you could therefore fit a lightning conductor to a church and to protect it. And White makes the point that traditionally in a storm, the bell ringers had congregated in the church and rung the bells to try and fend off the storm. And of course he knows deep down that probably didn't do a great deal of good. In fact, in sad cases, the bell ringers were occasionally struck by lightning that they had not been able to fend off. And White is making the point in his text that there was a resistance to fitting lightning conductors, because it looked like you were interfering with providence. It looked like you were being very presumptuous in trying to control the artillery of heaven, as he puts it. And he even calculates how many bell ringers got killed across Europe as a consequence of the failure of the churches to fit the device. For him, it's warfare between science and religion. Well, we got Huxley up there because in many essays and lay sermons in the same period, really the second half of the 19th century, Huxley wrote many essays in which he voiced very similar kind of anti-clerical themes. A statement of Huxley that's so often quoted captures it rather nicely. Extinguished theologians lie around the cradle of every new science, like snakes around the body of Hercules. Extinguished theologians. No matter how distinguished they were extinguished by scientific progress. And for Huxley, and this is an important point, the biblical accounts of creation were simply primitive and obsolete science. So it's conflict and it's also warfare. So my answer to that third question is that it's during the second half of the 19th century that the conflict thesis came to the fore and engaged the attention of the general public. I think this is the other important point. The public in return, nice little comment made by Owen Chadwick in one of his books, the public in return were often more interested in science versus religion than they were in science or in religion. So it's an interesting little insight, and one might be tempted to say the same is true of many of our media outlets today. My fourth question is, what were the grounds for these very strong claims for conflict and warfare? Are there sources of conflict or tension before the middle years of the 19th century? And I just want to run through a few of these because I believe that there were, and that it's actually misleading to give the impression that the conflict thesis just suddenly emerged, almost like a creation from nothing. The confidence with which Tyndall, Draper, White, and Huxley launched their assault on clerical establishments was sustained by their awareness that there had been problems and confrontations in the past. So I'm just going to run very quickly through a series of 4 or 5 little problems, not so little actually, that had occurred in previous centuries and that these writers were certainly familiar with. And I guess the first and obvious one is the question of sacred texts, how to interpret them, and how to interpret them when scientific discoveries seem to clash with them. To give a famous example, again going back to the Copernican debates, in the book of Joshua, in the Christian Old Testament, in chapter 10 and verse 12, Joshua commands the sun to stand still, which gives him extra daylight in which to rout his enemies. And the text says the sun did stand still in obedience to Joshua's command. And the problem was, if Joshua told the sun to stand still, that seems to suggest that it's already moving. And therefore, it is, if you like, a kind of an implicit, if not an explicit, assertion that it is the earth that is stationary and that it is the sun that moves. And that text troubled a lot of Christian scholars following the Copernican innovation. It troubled Luther, it troubled his educational right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon. It looks as if you've got a straight conflict between a new system of astronomy and a biblical text. And I think, in one sense, there was. And issues of that kind have certainly occurred in the period from Copernicus right down to the present day. There were ways of dealing with it, of course, and we can talk about some of those later. A second problem, we're still with sacred texts, is almost the converse. It was a problem noted by Augustine, and it's a problem that could arise if you used scientific or secular knowledge as a basis for biblical interpretation. Instead of using scripture to oppose the science, let's now take the science on board and reinterpret the scripture. But a different kind of problem arises there. Science is not static. It progresses, it moves forward all the time. And if you built your biblical exegesis on a particular scientific paradigm, particular scientific interpretation of natural phenomena, you could run into trouble when the science advanced. Augustine was certainly aware of that, and it's a recurring issue, still an issue, I think, today. The problem being that second case involves placing a great deal of confidence in the current state of science. And historians of science usually warn against that kind of confidence. So that's one issue. Second issue, if we've got a problem over how to interpret scripture, who is it who is controlling the meanings that we are allowed to propose? Who controls the meanings? And this was critical in the Galileo case, and you've already seen Cardinal Robert Bellarmine popped up just a little too soon, a moment ago. And here we have a very interesting clash between two ways of looking at biblical authority. Bellarmine claimed that following the Council of Trent, when the Catholic authorities had met to try to respond to the challenge of the Protestant Reformation, Bellarmine claimed that at the Council of Trent a very clear principle was laid down, that if the Church Fathers had agreed on how a particular biblical text was to be interpreted, then that consensus had to be respected. So if the Church Fathers had assumed that the earth was stationary on the basis of texts like Joshua 10:12, then that interpretation was sacrosanct. Galileo, on the other hand, pointed out that the Church Fathers lived before Copernicus, so how could they possibly have known that the earth went round the sun? And what one has to recognize from Galileo's point of view is that the language of Scripture is accommodated to the minds of the vulgar, the common herd of mankind. The biblical language is not technical scientific language, and therefore, from Galileo's point of view, there need be no conflict. Notice, though, there is a conflict between his position and Bellarmine's position. And that was one of the central issues in that whole tragic affair. So those who constructed conflict histories could appeal to examples of that kind. Most were not as sophisticated as that, but they are related to those issues. Third point here, while we're just illustrating some of the resources on which the conflict historians could draw, science had been associated, certainly from the Protestant Reformation onwards, with different forms of religious dissent. That's D-I-S-S-E-N-T, not the other kind of dissent. Religious heterodoxy, religious heresy. Scientific thinkers had sometimes fallen into that sort of category. It's interesting that Catholic critics of the new astronomy in the 17th century sometimes referred to the Calvinist Copernican system, as if Copernicanism had been, as it were, appropriated by the dissenters, by the Protestant authority. Many of Copernicus's protagonists were actually Lutherans. The Lutheran Reformation played a critical role in the popularization of a sun-centered universe. But of course, if you play on this relationship between science and religious dissent, you can push it a little further. By the time we reach Isaac Newton, familiar figure, by the time we reach Newton, we have a true heretic, judged by the standards of his day. Isaac Newton explicitly, certainly in his own writings, rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. He never made that knowledge public. Had he done so, he would have been dismissed from his fellowship at Trinity College. Actually, you don't need that picture. You can pop down the road and have a look for yourself. But Newton was a fellow of Trinity College, but he would not have been able to keep that fellowship had his heretical views been made known. So it's a classic case of a scientist who was deeply religious, it has to be said. That's a point that's often overlooked, but who is nevertheless a heretic. And if you want to construct a lineage linking science to heresy, then you can do that. An 18th century figure, Joseph Priestley, would be another example. A Unitarian Christian, and therefore not a Christian at all, judged by orthodox standards. Priestley argued that science gives us a model of progress and a means of progress. It leads to social advancement, to the improvement of the world. Science, and this is my fourth little example of a recurrent issue. Science certainly had been used to challenge religious authority from 16th century onwards, and one could probably go further back than that. Perhaps a nice example, staying with Newton just for a moment, would be the fact that Voltaire, French critic of the Catholic Church, particularly in France, Voltaire drew on Newton's science and published a translation of Newton's work into French, and that's the frontispiece. But notice the ray of light coming from that top left-hand corner. We're in Enlightenment mode here. It's the science that is creating the light. And Newton's science of a law-bound universe could be used by Voltaire to attack what he saw as the superstition and the authority of a Catholic Church which was still paying too much attention to the miraculous. So, really illuminating, I think, as an example of how there could be conflict. Science invoked, appropriated to challenge the authority of a church, which from Voltaire's point of view was simply intolerant of any other beliefs than its own. And for Voltaire, that is the great sticking point with ecclesiastical authority. Now, we could give more examples. During the European Enlightenment, there were several advances in the sciences that became similar kind of resources for anti-religious rhetoric. And here's one of my favourite examples. That is a polyp. It's actually an example of a hydra, which is a funny little creature that does somersaults on the bottom of canals. Well, a Swiss naturalist during the 18th century, with the wonderful name of Abraham Tremblay, got hold of a hatchet and chopped a polyp into pieces. And to his, that's the kind of thing you do every day. And what happens? All the pieces regenerated into new polyps. And this was an utterly sensational empirical discovery, reported right across Europe. And we're told that a wave of polyp chopping did indeed spread across Europe in the wake of Tremblay's amazing discovery. And you might think, whatever has this got to do with science and religion? But if you were bent on putting forward a materialistic interpretation of life, you've got here an example of how life can rematerialize, regenerate itself. It doesn't need a soul, it doesn't need a life force. It can do it by itself. And it's that kind of discovery that shows something of the self-organizing powers of matter, which incidentally fed very nicely into John Tyndall's Belfast Address, because Tyndall makes the memorable statement at one point, matter has been much maligned. Tyndall knows that matter is capable of doing many more things than particularly clerical commentators have allowed. So, matter can organize itself. Another contemporary, Lamettrie, wrote a book, Man the Machine, claiming that human beings are just machines. He describes us as perpendicular crawling machines. Slightly quaint description. But it's this mechanization of nature that can be used if you wish to attack religious authority. And just to add to the story, so that we do have some understanding of the conflict thesis, by the end of the 18th century, very significant changes had occurred in our understanding of the natural world, and each in its way had posed a challenge for traditional religious authority. By the end of the 18th century, Laplace had given account of the origin of the solar system, which famously did not require any kind of divine intervention. By the end of the 18th century, Joseph Priestley, whom we met just a few moments ago, had abolished spirits from the world. Priestley was a chemist. He's often granted rights in the discovery of oxygen. It's a very complicated story, actually. But interestingly, Priestley abolishes spirits from chemistry, and he abolishes spirits from the natural world. By the end of the 18th century, the Comte de Buffon in Paris has given a very different account of the history of the Earth from that which it obtained earlier. Buffon extends greatly the age of the Earth and divides it up into 6 great epochs. The Earth has gradually cooled, he suggests, from having originated in some emanation from the sun, some kind of collision between a star and some other body ejects the Earth. It then cools down over an immense period of time. But notice the Earth then has not always been as it was at creation. And that's the big change, because at the end of the 17th century, John Ray had actually, just going to take that back a moment, I think I'm blocking the, that's back to Buffon. The English natural theologian of the late 17th century, John Ray, had argued that by the works of creation, we mean the earth as it was originally created and as it has remained so ever since. So there's the contrast between a static view of creation and, by the end of the 18th century, a more dynamic view. And I just went ahead too soon there to Lamarck, who of course gives us the first serious theory of evolution, late 18th, early 19th century. And the critical change there is that living things are no longer creatures. Living things are products of nature. And it's a very interesting transposition. And it does pose a challenge, certainly did in this country. During the 19th century, there was increasing pressure on schemes of harmonization. And I don't want to spend too long on this, but let me just show you the fact that if one tried to reconcile this notion of a whole series of historical epochs during the Earth's development, if one wanted to harmonize that with some kind of Christian theology, then it was perfectly possible to do so. But there were issues, particularly concerning extinction, revealed in the fossil record, which were particularly difficult. The Oxford professor of geology is interesting in this respect, William Buckland, because he argued that God had created every creature that it is possible for him to create, but that it was not possible for them all to live simultaneously. And therefore you have in the fossil record a series of progressive creations. And I've just represented that schematically there. Look particularly at the horizontal lines, because this represents a switch during the Earth's history as a result of some kind of catastrophic event. So the flora and fauna in one epoch are not identical with those of another. So you could harmonize extinction with a notion of God's great power as a creator. In that kind of way, God had made everything that it was possible to make, but they couldn't coexist simultaneously. There were reasons, practical reasons, why that would be so. Now, it's harmonization schemes of this kind, which by about 1860 were beginning to wear a little bit thin. There were all kinds of other schemes, like these epochs correspond to each day of the 6 days of the Genesis creation narrative. By about 1860, these harmonization schemes are looking, as I say, rather fragile. And this means that by the middle years of the 19th century, Christian theologians themselves were beginning to think twice about whether science should be harmonized with religion in a straightforward way. And I just want to mention one commentator who wrote very interestingly around about 1858, 1859. This is the Oxford professor of geometry, Baden Powell, not the father of the Boy Scout movement, but certainly with the same family. And Powell came to the conclusion, having tried to promote the sciences in Oxford during the 19th century, Powell came to the conclusion that the best way of achieving harmony between science and religion was simply to keep them apart. So science has authority when it comes to describing, explaining how nature works. The role of theology is in the moral sphere. So for moral authority, we turn to theology, but for interpreting nature, understanding how it works, we turn to science. The point I'm making here is that by the middle years of the 19th century, traditional schemes of harmony between science, new science like geology, for example, and religion, those schemes were breaking down. And I think in various ways that made it easier for the conflict writers, because they could tell stories about how science itself had broken down these harmonization schemes. Well, what I'd like to do, just as we come to an end, because the main idea has been to try to explain what the conflict thesis was and how it came about, let's just very quickly run through some of the reasons why we might say there is something wrong with the conflict thesis. What is wrong with the conflict thesis? First thing, it fails to distinguish between conservative and liberal parties within religious traditions. You will always find reactions to new discoveries. You find them among the scientific community as well. If we just perhaps give a couple of examples from mid-19th century England, we've seen that Wilberforce attacked Darwin, but one of his own ordinands, Frederick I think what I'm going to do is just move forward. Yes, this is where I want to be. Frederick Temple preached a sermon in Oxford the day after Wilberforce and Huxley had their debate. And he represents a liberal strand within Anglican Christianity at that time. He went on to become Archbishop of Canterbury later in the 19th century. But Temple is interesting because in that sermon, where he talks about the present relations between science and religion, he welcomes the expansion of scientific naturalism. He welcomes the imposition of laws on the world through scientific knowledge. Temple's actually, gosh, I nearly said Templeton, that would be a little Freudian slip, but Temple actually argued very interestingly that the more we know of the fixed laws of the natural world, the more probable it is, that there are also moral laws to which we are also subservient or should be. It's a very interesting sermon, very interesting lecture. Temple also contributed to a book called Essays and Reviews that came out in 1860, which in a very mild form explained new ways of interpreting the Bible historically, placing it in the context in which it was written, and arguing that the Bible should be read like any other book, even claiming that the authors of Scripture were fallible men who simply assumed things about the world that were current at the time that they wrote. Now that's a rather different view from the more conservative position that Wilberforce represented. In fact, Wilberforce wrote a review of Essays and Reviews which was far more violent than anything he ever said about Darwin's theory. So, When we look more closely at religious responses to science, we find those responses are usually divided. They're not homogeneous. Secondly, religion has actually been a very important resource in the promotion of science. And this is something that the conflict theorists were, I think, very reluctant to admit. This is especially visible in the 17th century, when religious considerations helped to make the scientist's dream of power over nature socially respectable. There's an interesting example in the writings of Francis Bacon. When Bacon promotes his experimental philosophy, we gain knowledge through experience, according to Bacon, through experimentation, through investigation of the world. When he emphasizes that, Bacon says that this represents a much more humble approach to nature than sitting in an armchair and philosophizing and trying to work out how God must have made the world. The scholastic commentators on Aristotle, they were arrogant as far as Bacon's concerned, and never produced anything which was practically useful. But let's get out there into the world and discover what kind of world God really has made, rather than pontificate about it through philosophy. And so that experimental method was linked in Bacon's mind to the virtue of humility. And many other experimental scientists of the 17th century would make reference to a similar kind of argument. Applied science for Bacon, as in medicine or agriculture, these are not only obviously attractive and important for improving the world, but they are good works in themselves. The Christian religion to which he subscribed stressed that your faith should be made plain, should be made visible through good works. And for Bacon, technology is, or can be, a good work if it is properly controlled. In other words, science for Bacon becomes a kind of religious duty. And it's a duty to study both books of which God is the author. The book of his word, the scriptures, and the book of God's works, the natural world, the creation. And just as the Christian has a duty to study the one book, the Bible, so for Bacon and many who followed him, there was a comparable duty to study the book of God's works. And science and religion were therefore bonded together through this kind of argumentation. And it took a particularly clear form in the natural theology of the 18th and 19th centuries. And by natural theology, I mean the attempt to learn something about the nature of God from the study of his works, the study of his creation. I mentioned John Ray earlier, and the title of his book, I think, epitomizes this philosophical and theological movement, which was very durable. Ray there, writing of the wisdom of God manifested in the works of creation. Isaac Newton thought that the beauty of the solar system could only be understood as the product of an intelligent and wise creator. And in the life sciences, the great Swedish botanist Linnaeus draws a very interesting parallel between nature as a museum and a museum at the opening of which he was present in Sweden. Linnaeus says it is only human beings, no other animal, it's only human beings who can appreciate the beauty and craftsmanship in nature. And because it's only human beings who can appreciate it, we have a moral obligation to study it. And so there is a powerful argument for the importance of science coming from that theological consideration. And this kind of natural theology survived long after Darwin, and some see it as undergoing some kind of revival today. Notice that it was not actually killed off by Darwin, despite what many would have you believe. Darwin himself speaks about the laws of nature being designed. Designed laws, two words you often find side by side in Darwin. He writes to Asa Gray at one point, "I've come to see the living forms in the world as the consequence of designed laws, but with the details left to chance." He's never entirely happy with that formula, but he doesn't rule out, and nor did Huxley actually, rule out the idea that there could be a wider teleology, that evolution itself is only possible because of certain preconditions. Those preconditions might have been designed. Well, I'm almost through, but there is one really important point that I would just like to stress, and that is advances in science, as we've seen, have challenged traditional religious beliefs, but they have never entailed atheism. Darwin himself says, "I have never been an atheist," in the sense of denying the existence of God. Indeed, in another letter, Darwin says, "It would be absurd to suggest that one cannot believe in evolution and at the same time be a theist. It would be absurd." And the reason is that the broader cultural meanings that we give to science, as distinct from scientific theories themselves, the broader cultural meanings and interpretations usually depend on a whole range of beliefs and values that are themselves not determined by science. And in many cases, I think this is an important point, in many cases the greatest threat to religion has come not from science, but from religion. Conflict between different religions, or even between different religious traditions, has been a powerful source of skepticism. And perhaps I might just finish a little picture of the epitome of the 18th century Enlightenment in many ways, David Hume, who in his attack on reports of the miraculous does not say, might imply it at one point, but he doesn't say miracles must be rejected because they are scientifically impossible. What he does say is that miracles must be deeply suspected because every religious tradition has its own set of miracles, and they therefore, to the skeptical mind, cancel each other out, and to support a religion based on the appeal to the miraculous just will not work. So conflicts that may look like science versus religion, or religion versus science, often turn out to be conflicts about something else. It can be conflicts between two different forms of science, as in the Galileo effect. Galileo is promoting Copernican astronomy against the astronomy of Ptolemy and the physics of Aristotle. Similarly, what may look like religion versus science can be an internal conflict within religion, which gives the impression that there is some kind of hostility with science, but it may simply not be the case. One very last remark, and it was going to be my very last question, but I've been speaking for too long. My last question was going to be, what do we do then with the conflict thesis, given that it has these deficiencies? My good friend and colleague Geoffrey Cantor has recently raised that very question. And he makes the point, and I think I would want to defend this. He makes the point that just because the conflict thesis is wrong, we should not accept the notion that there is therefore and always has been perfect harmony between science and religion. And we cannot draw that conclusion because we know that many scientists and theologians in the past have wrestled with the issues thrown up by new forms of science and new forms of theology. Tycho Brahe, Protestant astronomer, contemporary of Kepler and Galileo too for a while. Tycho Brahe tells us he struggled for ages trying to come to terms with the Copernican innovation. And he never quite did, because he said the Bible prohibited the motion of the earth. So how does he handle it? Very cleverly. The earth remains central in the universe and static. All the other planets go round the sun, and the sun goes round the earth carrying those planets. Darwin would be a good example of a scientist who definitely struggled, not least because his wife was a very pious lady herself, struggling with how his understanding of the world could or perhaps could not be reconciled with traditional religious belief. Or one last example, William James, author of that famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Following the Darwinian revolution, James struggled with how it can possibly be that human beings have free will in a universe that's now been mechanized, even to the extent of embracing humankind. And James says that I woke up day after day with a feeling of horrible dread. That's not harmony between science and religion. It's wrestling with a problem. But the point Geoffrey Cantor makes, and this really is my last, the point that Geoffrey Cantor makes is that it is precisely in those struggles, precisely in that deep reflection about the implications of science for one's understanding of one's place in the universe. It's precisely there where progress is made. And so we shouldn't delete those struggles from our histories, because they're very much part of what it is to be human. I apologize. I have exceeded my limits. But I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into where the conflict thesis came from, when it hit the public ceiling, and what some of its deficiencies may be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And we certainly have some time for questions. Rodney?
Yes, thank you very much, John. Brilliant as ever. I've got a question about Bruno.
Yes.
Because there was speculation about many worlds long before Bruno. I mean, the 12th century degree of Paris said that God could make as many worlds as he liked. Nicholas of Cusa was a cardinal and speculated that it was 150 years before Bruno. So,
now here we have to do a little bit of very subtle history. Because it is true that those figures you have mentioned say that because of God's omnipotence, and omniscience, it would be possible for God to have made many worlds any inhabitable. It would be possible. And therefore those who follow Aristotle in saying that it is impossible are setting up a human authority, namely Aristotle, in opposition to God's power. It would be possible, they say, for God to do this. But they're walking a tightrope, because they don't actually say that he has done. Okay? Bruno, all set for a fight, Bruno says he has done, must have done, because if God is infinitely powerful, that power can only find expression in the real creation of an infinite number of worlds. So Bruno is introducing a rationale for the real existence of an infinite universe, is transferring attributes to the universe which have traditionally belonged only to God, namely infinitude, and at the same time, and this is what leads to the real problem, he will not repent. And one of the criteria for determining punishable heresy was whether one was willing to repent. And I think in the last analysis, Bruno got burnt because of his obstinacy. He just would not cede any ground. Now, it has to be said that he was a marked man anyway. There were rumours abroad that he'd said things like, all monks are asses, that the Roman Catholic Church's doctrines are asinine, and that Jesus Christ got what he deserved. Now, if you go around, well, it's hard to believe that he said that, but if you go around saying things like that, you don't on the whole have a long life in that time. And if the rumours are circulating that he's been saying things like that, it all adds up to a case that really, I think, tragic in many ways that it was, becomes fully explicable. But that's the answer to your question. It's the difference between what God in his omnipotent power could have done and what Bruno says he has done.
Thank you. Right. You've got number, okay, yes.
Thank you for mentioning faith and power, because to my sense of things, you can get rid of the conflict by realizing that religion helps you implement science, but science doesn't help you implement anything of the religious nature, because one is essentially behavioral and the other one is essentially mechanical. And perhaps I could just mention just one thing. Lord Keynes, after the First World War, out of his understanding of the science of economics, said all we're doing by implementing war operations is sowing the seeds for the next World War. When that then happened, his religious beliefs, his behavioral attitudes allowed him at the end of the Second World War, because he couldn't do it at the end of the First World War, to go along to Truman and say, you have to understand the science, you have to implement the Marshall Plan to stop a Third World War. And to me that's a tremendous example of his religious beliefs, his behavioral attitudes, then allowing him to implement the science of economics.
It's a very interesting example. One thing that's always fascinated me is how close Powell's position in 1858-59 is to that of Stephen Jay Gould in his book Rocks of Ages, where Gould wants to stake out the separate magisteria of science and religion, allowing for both, and therefore, of course, deeply antagonizing those like Richard Dawkins and others who just want to eliminate religion from the world. But there's a very close similarity that Gould gives moral authority to the churches, the religious traditions to which you belong, and science, of course, has the authority for explaining how the world works. And it's a kind of default position that can indeed have a lot to commend it. It does avoid a lot of the wrangles that have rather needlessly occupied some in the past.
Exactly.
But let me just take up your war example, because one book I very much enjoyed reading a couple of years or so ago was a new biography of the Quaker physicist Arthur Eddington. And the biography is by Matthew Stanley. And Eddington was a Quaker belonging to that radical Christian sect. And because of Quaker beliefs about pacifism, Eddington did not get involved directly in the First World War, and he suffered a good degree of opprobrium because of that. But that pacifism found expression in his wishing to maintain contact between British and German scientists at a time when there was obviously animosity and hostility between them. And it's largely through Eddington, if I have read that story correctly, it's largely through Eddington's religious beliefs and commitment to pacifism that he ensures that Einstein's reputation is kept alive among British scientists during that period. And of course it's Eddington who leads the expedition then to verify Einstein's relativity principles. So that's a very interesting way of how a strong religious commitment finds expression in bringing two scientific communities closer together that had actually been separated through war. And I found that interesting because, as Stanley points out, it is usually assumed that science is intrinsically universal, and therefore you would not expect that there would need to be some kind of intervention to ensure the universal congruence.
Thank you.
But,
Lydia, you had a question?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
What would be reasons for the conflict thesis taken on in France 100 years earlier? I just was thinking of Fontenelle. This would even be 200 years earlier.
Indeed, yes.
What would be some of the reasons?
Yes. I think one has to look very carefully at the differences between Protestant and Catholic politics. And it seems to me that in Catholic countries, the anti-clericalism has always been a stronger force than in the more latitudinarian kind of politics that you tend to find in Protestant cultures. So it's interesting, Descartes, because if we're talking about Fontenelle, we can then just go straight back to Descartes, because Fontenelle is popularizing the Cartesian system very largely in 1686. Fontenelle's Conversations on the Plurality of Worlds, for those of you who don't know, is a book, beautiful dialogue between a philosopher and a marchioness. Actually, that needs explaining, because one of my students once spelled marchioness M-A-R-T. I-N-E-S-S, the woman from Mars, which actually would have been entirely appropriate. but it's a dialogue between a marchioness, an aristocratic lady, who is being educated by the philosopher into a new vision of the universe in which there may well be other worlds. And it's built largely out of Descartes' mechanistic philosophy, where Descartes argues that all the stars are themselves suns like our star, like our sun. So every star can be the center of another world. And Fontenelle is explaining this to the Marchioness. And Lydia is pointing out that there is a real sense, I think, in that book where you get the new, the innovative, the science-based vision of a very different world from that which the Marchioness had been, as it were, educated into. And Fontenelle's work was immensely popular. It went through many, many editions. It's popularizing this mechanistic system of Descartes, which he did not think was anti-clerical or anti-Catholic, because Descartes says that when we interpret events in nature mechanistically, it is still the case that God is recreating those phenomena from one moment to the next. In other words, God's role as creator is not just something at the beginning of time, but God is all the time doing something, sustaining the world, recreating it even in being, which is a very profound religious position if you wish to take that view. But it still remains the case that Descartes' science was rejected by the Catholic authorities in France. Particularly his attempt to reconcile his mechanistic understanding of matter with the Eucharist, that was put on the index later in the 17th century. So I think it's obviously a very complicated story, but I do get a sense in which looking at the intellectual elite in France in the middle years of the 18th century, there is this very strong aversion to the claims for authority of a church which is just so intolerant of what seemed like something crucial for science, the freedom of thought. You know, I don't know that you get, and there's no book published in France, I think, in the middle of the 18th century, which explicitly has the title, The Conflict Between Science and Religion. But it's tacitly there in the Encyclopédie, in some of the articles. And one would therefore need to look at other Catholic countries as well. And it is, of course, in Italy where the repercussions of the Galileo affair are felt so keenly and for so long. But it's a really good question, because what it shows is a very general historical point, which is that in all these debates about the respective claims of science and religion, the form that those debates take is always going to depend on local, social and political variables. And it's interesting that some of the key events we remember today are events which had a very particular local context, like Huxley Wilberforce in Oxford, of all places, in 1860, a bastion of the clerical tradition within Anglicanism. Then again, in America, the Scopes trial, on which Ed, who's speaking later, has written so brilliantly. And there are many, many examples you could find. Tyndall's lecture in 1874, it's a local public event shaped by local politics, the refusal of the Catholic College in Ireland to put science in its curriculum. So your question has got many, many ramifications, that we shouldn't think we can analyse debates about science and religion in vacuo. There is always a context, and the context often is a local one, and it often makes a very big difference to how the events are construed.
Okay, we've got time for one more quick question before tea and coffee, so thank you.
Yeah, you just formulated the root of conflict thesis in terms of that science and religion have got essence and nature which conflict together. This is a philosophical question, but you gave a historical answer to it. So I think if it is a philosophical question, it has to be answered in the field of philosophy of science, not history of science. And one more little question is that, do you know if anyone now who works specifically in the field of science and religion defends the conflict thesis? I'm not talking about scientists may have this idea or religious people may have this idea, but something who is working specifically in this area and is against your idea and believes no, there is a conflict between these two.
Two very good questions, I should say. I agree with you about the first one, that the question whether you could search for some essence of science and some essence of religion and analyze philosophically whether those two essences that you have defined necessarily conflict or not. That is a philosophical question. I think my instincts as a historian would simply be that I don't know really what we gain by trying to, in my view, rather artificially construct some essence of science and some essence of religion, just to see how they might relate together. And I say that simply because when you look at the history of science, there is just such enormous diversity in scientific practices, in scientific methods, in the variation from the life sciences to the physical sciences, variations in the way science is funded, the values that have supported or in some cases impeded scientific work. To think that one can come up with some simple, all-embracing essentialist definition that can capture that is, I think, misguided. I used to attend conferences many, many years ago where one would often see a title of a paper in the program. What is the best account of the relationship between science and religion? And by the time I had attended a few of those conferences and heard versions of that paper, I was tearing my hair out because it just did not get anywhere near to dealing with science, the reality of science in history, and indeed the reality of religious practices in history. So, I agree with you. It is a philosophical issue if you set up the problem that way. What I was trying to suggest was that the history, precisely because of the diversity, does pose an intrinsic challenge to that kind of philosophical entry. Second question was, are there examples of current scholars who are deliberately, as it were, trying to recover and reaffirm the conflict thesis? I don't know of any reputable historian of science who is trying to go back to the stage we were at, shall we say, 30 or 40 years ago, when it was often simply taken for granted that the advance of scientific naturalism had displaced God from the world and that's all there was to the story. What I do see happening, and I guess the tone of my talk today was in some measure a response to that, is that I actually see the argument going too far the other way. When I wrote my own book on science and religion, it was published in 1991, I had one section attacking the conflict thesis, and then I had another section attacking the harmony thesis. But interestingly, people always focus on the first bit, forgetting that I also attacked the essentialist harmony thesis. And what I see happening, particularly among some religious writers, I'm finding the assumption that historians have now so demolished the conflict thesis that there is no point even talking about it. It's totally discredited. There's an article in the latest issue of an American journal, Theology and Science, and the title of the article really caught my eye because it is The Warfare That Never Was. And the author picks on 3 examples that historians like myself have examined and pointed out that the idea of warfare doesn't really help us to understand what was actually happening. But notice what is happening. The critique of the warfare thesis is being extended. The warfare that never was. Well, I never said the warfare never was. And other historians who've written about this, I think, have never said that. So there is a danger of a certain kind of religious apologetic, which is taking the revisionist historiography of historians of science and religion, but wanting to make too much capital out of that. And such people ought to read the second section of my book, because I certainly never wanted to suggest that there had never been conflict. And as I say, Geoffrey Cantor, in a book published by Cambridge University Press just a couple of years ago, he is saying we do need very carefully to examine the struggles that people had. The mistake with the conflict thesis was that it was just a huge generalization imposed on many hundreds of years of history. And it just wasn't a refined tool of analysis.
Okay, I think we really should finish there with plenty of chance to put your questions in the plastic box for the panel discussion this evening. Let's thank John very much for a fascinating